Social media giants exercise their power to influence the global conversation with a series of suspensions and bans aimed at reducing the threat of violence following the invasion of the U.S. Capitol. It's prompted debate about the silencing of free speech, but also questions around the effectiveness of this approach. Dr. Wayne Shi is an assistant professor of communication at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's an expert on disinformation and political division on social media and studies what he calls the 3D problem of digital platforms: discord, distrust, and dishonesty. Dr. Shi, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me here.
You suggest you could throw in a fourth D here, which would be distraction, and that's actually a great place to start. You've studied the topic of fringe politics and social movements extensively. Can you give us a brief overview of what your research into this 4D problem has revealed?
So for the past few years, I've been looking into how political far-right groups use digital platforms to carve out a unique political identities or agenda across digital communities to create alternative voices and to fight the so-called information war against political opponents. And what I found was that the political far right groups, kind of going back to the 4D, the discord, the distrust, deceptions, and distractions. Actually, the far right groups can be very digitally savvy with tapping into leveraging platform algorithms and tapping into this global populist resentment to create noises, to create disinformation campaigns. And so my recent research shows that how several far-right groups in the alt-right movements infiltrated into a progressive movement by hijacking progressive hashtags, by co-opting liberal talking points, by creating derogatory memes, name callings, and not to mention the use of Twitter bots and trolls to create divisions and destructions. And so there's something unique about this wave of far-right political movements in digital space. So what I found was that it is sort of a combination of traditional political mobilizations and modern day Web 2.0 digital connective actions. So they do have the traditional elements. If you look at the recent QAnon, MAGA, they do seem to be inspired by a national leader, the former president and his administrations, and several high-profile but shady, but kind of shadow super PACs are funding a lot of the disinformation campaigns in the digital space. So they seem to have this organizational support. But on the other end, the MAGA or QAnon, they function very much like those decentralized, fluid digital culture. They very much like the digital memes that jumps from place to place, spread from one community to another. They take the form of hashtags, internet memes, some talking points, some agenda claims and narratives, or viral post. And they could spread like wildfires, and they could mutate along the way.
Interesting. Several accounts have been suspended or banned on various platforms, most notably, as you say, former President Trump, and some 70,000 QAnon accounts removed from Twitter. Now, we've heard that disinformation was reduced 73% in the wake of that decision. What do you see as the implications of deplatforming, and why do you suggest it could potentially have unintended consequences?
Well, I think that we are very much in uncharted territory. So what I mean by that is, yes, the deplatforming is necessary to stop the immediate national security threat, to make sure that there's a peaceful transfer of power, which we are glad to see today. However, that hardly tackles the root problem, because well, for a couple of reasons. For one, those users can migrate to what many scholars call the altered text space. So we're talking about Parler, CloudHub, Telegrams. These are the space that are created for people who are booted off or deplatformed from mainstream sites. And yes, there's a growing pressures for internet service providers or cloud solution providers to deplatform services or actors who do not comply with their terms of use. But those users the most partisan, the most radical element of the community can always migrate to non-US platforms. Parler currently seems to be supported by a company that's owned by Russian nationals. We have evidence of the British far right has some kind of presence on VK, which is the Russian #1 social networking site. And Telegram is also non-US service providers, and CloudHub, which is run on a system of independent solution providers. So they can always find a space. But what's more concerning, I think, is that the deplatforming, unfortunately, plays right into this talking point that, oh, the big tech is censoring conservative voices. And I wouldn't be surprised that in the future we might have apps or platforms that brand themselves as this sort of a counter-public, counter-mainstream, free speech platforms.
Well, there's no question we've been hearing cancel culture, censorship, assault on freedom of speech. But if you do agree to terms of service when you sign up to these platforms, is it censorship if terms and conditions are violated?
Well, I wouldn't call it censorship. It's mostly editorial decisions by tech firms that should be called media outlets, because a lot of the tech firms, they are basically functioning as the primary gateway to political information for a big chunk of the U.S. public. And I think whether it's a censorship or not, I think it's best left to the legal experts. But I think there are several things here. We do agree. I mean, there's a consensus among the public and policymakers that a small number of technology firms have served as the backbone of our digital infrastructure. They become the gateway to information, and their algorithms are shaping the media reality we live in. So there's no doubt that they're too powerful, and we need to discuss the political implications of these major platforms and their business practice, but also their content moderations. When it comes to many people kind of use this deplatforming as to call it an attack on press freedoms or First Amendment issues, right? But we're not talking about First Amendment. We're not talking about government enacting laws concerning speech. It's mostly, content moderations made by private companies for a righteous cause. But I think that the more concerning trend is that that's something that we're going to see more and more in the future, in the coming years. The discussions concerning the political powers of big tech.
Well, you've suggested that platforms and regulators should address the root cause, as you mentioned earlier. What do you see as that root cause, and how should it be addressed?
Well, I wouldn't say it is a root cause, but a deeper cause is that across the board, we see this rising distrust in the institutions, mainstream media, academics, science, established political parties, and the medical field, right? So this rising distrust, insurrectionist sentiment, and I think there's a sense of marginalization or a sense of not being heard or not being taken seriously. That is, which is a sentiment widely shared by people on the conservative side. So I look at those posts that are in the far right space. It's a bit ironic because in my research, I use this concept called counter-public. So the idea is that people who are marginalized or people who think they're marginalized, they gather around, they cultivate a media space for themselves and to produce new narratives and alter narratives. Historically, this is a term that is used to describe progressive movements or tend to be associated with a community of color. But we will see a lot of the far-right politics or digital operations follow the logics of counterpublic. They think they are marginalized in these societies, and they wanted to use the digital space as this counter space, a counter-public space, where they can cultivate these identities to propagate their narratives. And that's why we hear conversations about cancel culture, about big tech censorship. It's all kind of centered around this sense of marginalizations. And I think that the cause is that, well, we need to address this sense of marginalization. Now we need to acknowledge that that they are political groups, they are populist leaders who are exploiting this sense of marginalizations for partisan agendas. But also part of that concerns or sense of displacement of marginalizations could be a result of decades of neoliberal economic policies, globalizations, that we need to hear. We need to acknowledge the political sources of the marginalization, the sense of marginalization, which could be misplaced. But we should also kind of talk to the real voters, the real Trump supporters, the real far-right figures to hear, to understand where their anger comes from, where their frustration comes from.
Well, and when is a ban or a suspension a ban or a suspension? Facebook says it banned QAnon, yet there's still content. Gab says it moderates and has zero tolerance regarding the incitement of violence, but many such posts remain. Parler had to just simply seek out a new host. Are there potentially legal consequences of an unmoderated site, or a site that perpetuates disinformation, organized hate, the incitement of violence?
Well, we currently do not have a robust legal framework to tackle a lot of the issues that we see, right? The disinformation or hate speech or foreign propagandas or radicalized content. And I think, but one thing that we see is that there's a growing public pressures on companies to be accountable to what is produced on their platforms. So there's that growing public pressures, which could lead big tech firms to be more transparent about their content moderation policies, to take more preemptive actions against problematic content. But I have some concerns about where this is heading to, right? So first of all, it takes years or if not decades to come up with a robust legal frameworks that can be applicable to the digital domains, while preserving the freedoms and anonymity of the users. And if we look at also, earlier I mentioned that these migrations, digital migrations to ultra text space, to non-US platforms. So the question is, do we have a global legal framework to tackle that? So what if those speech, the content is not produced on US-based platforms? If it's produced, it's spread on a Russian server, a Russian platforms, but are well subscribed by the domestic far-right users of. And so do we have that coherent frameworks? And also we need to think about the technical difficulties in just detecting those content. Earlier you mentioned that yes, those companies took action, but there's still a sizable amount of QAnon related accounts that are still remain on those platforms. That just speaks to the technical difficulties of detecting those content, because this is sort of a digital. It's not a well-organized, it's not a well-defined political movement. It's sort of very fluid and decentralized digital political culture. And our machines, our artificial intelligence are just not smart enough to take into the consideration of the political context of each post and tag those that are potentially dangerous or problematic.
Well, you talked about the importance of transparency. In your opinion, what is it going to take to help rebuild trust in mainstream media and these platforms?
Well, that's a billion-dollar question, and I hope I have answered to that. But I think that we can start with something, some small steps, right? So many of my colleagues advocate um, adopting this PBS model of social media or a public media model of social media to ensure that we have a strong competitors to those corporate owned media platforms, mainstream media platforms, or social media platforms. And those will be alternative social media platforms that are publicly owned and will be publicly supervised, and they do not put people they do not put profit above people. And well, why that idea sounds, a bit idealistic, but we can look at some of the very successful public projects in our digital space. If we look at Wikipedia, right, which is a very a vibrant knowledge sharing projects, which involves the general publics. It isn't controlled by single corporations. It doesn't have that is not tied to any state government, and it remains to be a reputable source, at least for a big chunk of the online publics. We can also look at the online open source communities that produce the software and gadgets that powers the backbone of our digital economy, and this community involves the everyday developers who participate in voluntary ways to build better services. Now, maybe building a digital platforms will be very, very different from building an online encyclopedias or softwares, right? Because it involves the quality of the information, the ever evolving news scenes, and politics, not to mention, all the political powers that are trying to influence the online platform. But I think one way to be more transparent and accountable is to make sure the users are made aware of where that information is coming from. And one thing that we can use is to use those nudge theories, for example, having a browser extension just to inform users of the potential political affiliations of certain websites or certain claims. Now, user may disagree with that approach. They will say that this is a part of plot to, brainwash. But you will still, by providing that information, I think you would just creating that norms in the digital space that allowing all information providers to be very intentional and be very transparent about where they get information, and just to give the audience a balanced picture of their information collection process.
Well, there is no doubt this debate will continue. Fringe groups and extremists were organizing on the internet before the advent of social media networks and are not going away. Dr. Shi, thank you so much for sharing your perspective on this very timely topic.
Thank you.